In 2013, a team of geneticists at the University of Glasgow set out to answer a question nobody had ever tested directly. Everybody assumed they already knew where most of Jamaica's ancestors came from in Africa. The shipping records seemed to settle it. A century of careful documentation, ship by ship, port by port. But shipping records only tell you who got on a boat. They don't tell you who survived the crossing, who survived the plantation, who lived long enough to have children, and whose bloodline actually made it all the way to today, sitting in a living person's cells right now. So the researchers did something nobody had done before at this scale. They took DNA from living Jamaicans, specifically the maternal line, the mitochondrial DNA passed down mother to daughter, essentially unchanged for thousands of years, immune to the usual scrambling that happens every generation, and compared it directly against genetic samples from populations across the entire West African coast, region by region, including Ghana. The result didn't just fail to match the shipping records. It contradicted them in a way the researchers themselves described as genuinely incongruous, with everything the historical numbers said should have happened. And when they went looking for an explanation, they found one hiding in plain sight, in the very language millions of Jamaicans speak every single day, without ever knowing why. Here's what everyone thought they knew going in. Between 1650 and 1807, the Bight of Biafra, modern-day eastern Nigeria, sent more enslaved people to Jamaica than any other single region on the West African coast, and by a wide margin in the trade's final decades. The paperwork is clear on this. Ship manifests, port records, the voyage's transatlantic slave trade database, built from thousands of individual voyage records. All of it points the same direction. Historians estimate that roughly 159,000 enslaved women alone arrived in Jamaica from the Bight of Biafra during this period, with more than two-thirds of them arriving in the final decades before the trade ended. Once plantation society had become more settled and family formation among the enslaved was actually increasing, Biafra wins by volume decisively. Ghana's Gold Coast, meanwhile, sent noticeably fewer people to Jamaica by comparison across the same period. And by the later years of the trade, importation from that specific region had been declining for years, losing ground to other coasts. On paper, Gold Coast should have been a smaller, fading piece of Jamaica's genetic picture by the time the trade ended in 1807. A coast that mattered more in Jamaica's early colonial decades than in the ones that actually built the island's final enslaved population. That's the mystery the DNA was supposed to help settle. It didn't settle it the way anyone expected. Before we get to the results, tell us your parish in the comments, and if you've ever done a DNA test yourself, tell us what region came back highest for you. We're building a real, informal data set out of these comments, and it's already started confirming some of what tonight's video is about to show you. Subscribe if this is new to you. New research, new records, every week. Quick note before we get into the results. We built a tool where you can type in your own surname and see what we've documented on it. Parish, estate, historical record, whatever we've found so far. It's linked below. This video is about DNA and geography, not individual surnames. But if you want the two put side by side for your own name, that's exactly what the tool is for. Now, the result that shocked the researchers themselves. Despite sending fewer people to Jamaica overall, and despite that number actively declining in the final decades of the slave trade, the Gold Coast, Ghana, came out as the single largest genetic contributor to Jamaica's population today. Not close to Biafra, ahead of it. The region with the smaller, shrinking share of the historical shipping numbers somehow left the deepest genetic mark on the island 200 years later. The 2013 study wasn't alone in finding this. A companion study published the year before, using a separate demographic model, reached the same conclusion independently. Modern Jamaicans showed a closer genetic affinity to the Gold Coast and the neighboring Bight of Benin than the shipping records alone would ever predict. Despite what the researchers described as high mortality, low birth rates, and declining importation from that exact region throughout the period. Two separate research teams, two separate methods, the same contradiction. Despite sending fewer people to Jamaica overall, and despite that number actively declining in the final decades of the slave trade, the Gold Coast, Ghana, came out as the single largest genetic contributor to Jamaica's population today. Not close to Biafra, ahead of it. The region with the smaller, shrinking share of the historical shipping numbers somehow left the deepest genetic mark on the island 200 years later. The 2013 study wasn't alone in finding this. A companion study published the year before, using a separate demographic model, reached the same conclusion independently. Modern Jamaicans showed a closer genetic affinity to the Gold Coast and the neighboring Bight of Benin than the shipping records alone would ever predict. Despite what the researchers described as high mortality, low birth rates, and declining importation from that exact region throughout the period. Two separate research teams, two separate methods, the same contradiction. If the Glasgow study stood alone, you might call it a statistical curiosity. It doesn't stand alone. A separate genetic study, this one focused specifically on the descendants of the Accompong Town Maroons, the communities of self-liberated Africans who fought British colonial forces to a standstill in the mountains of western Jamaica and won their own independent territory, found the same Gold Coast signal, even more concentrated. That result lines up perfectly with something this channel has never had to guess about, because it's still spoken out loud today. Jamaican Maroon communities preserve a ritual language called Cromanti, used in ceremonies, in spirit possession rituals, in addressing ancestors, and Cromanti is built almost entirely from Akan, not influenced by it, built from it. The Maroons who won their freedom by force and whose DNA shows the strongest Gold Coast signal of any group on the island are also the exact community that kept a nearly unbroken Akan ritual language alive for 300 years. The genetics and the culture are telling the same story from two completely different directions, and they arrive at the same answer. That's the part that shocked even the scientists who ran the numbers. It's not that the shipping records were wrong about who got on the boats. It's that survival itself wasn't random. And 200 years later, the DNA of living Jamaicans and the language still coming out of their mouths every day are both a record of who made it, not just who left. One honest caveat, because this channel doesn't hide the limits of its own sources. This particular study specifically measured mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line only, mother to daughter, generation after generation. It says almost nothing about the paternal line, and nothing at all about any individual white overseer or enslaver ancestry, which doesn't show up in mtDNA at all. The sample size, while real and peer-reviewed, was drawn from several hundred volunteers. Precise birth information down to the parish was available for 86% of them, not the entire population of Jamaica. That's a strong, published, scientifically legitimate finding, but a sample, not a census. There's a second limit worth naming honestly, too. Admixture models like this one work by comparing the genetic profile of living Jamaicans against aggregated modern African populations, grouped by historical coastal region. That's a careful, defensible method, but it's still a model, built on populations living in Africa today, standing in for populations that existed there 2 and 3 centuries ago. What the study proves is a real, replicated, population-level pattern. reinforced independently by a second demographic study and by the Maroon-specific research. It doesn't prove which specific region any one individual Jamaican family descends from. That still requires the kind of parish-level, document-based research this channel does every single week. Here's what this really means. For 200 years, the paperwork told one story about where Jamaica came from. A story built entirely on who got loaded onto a ship. Then a small team of geneticists ran the actual biology and found a second story sitting underneath it, confirmed again by a completely separate study of the Maroons, and confirmed a third time by a language millions of people speak every day without ever being told why. Not a contradiction of the historical record, a completion of it. The ships carried one truth. The bloodline carried another. The language carried a third, hiding inside words like duppy and niam and anansi that Jamaican children have been raised on for centuries, never told those words were actually a genetic record too. All three are real. None of them is the whole picture without the other two. Drop your parish below, and if you've ever tested your own DNA, tell us what came back. And go check your surname using the tool linked in the description. See what the documents say about your specific name. Now that you know what the biology and the language both say about the island as a whole. The ledgers counted who left Africa. The DNA counted who Jamaica actually became. And the language, it turns out, had been telling us the answer the entire time. We just never thought to ask it the question.